Hello. Hello, everybody. We're going to start our meeting today. So thank you all for coming. I want to thank Jen for coming back and helping with AV and with Todd for helping with AV. Woo! Woo, woo, woo. And to Jim Murphy for taking attendance. If you haven't been signed in yet, he's the one you want to find. And I'm Alex. I'm filling in for Mary Ann, who is on a tour as we speak. So we're going to go right into it. And I want to introduce our member, Carla Stein, who's going to introduce our speaker for tonight. So yay.
So I'm very excited to introduce Liz Covart. She's the host of Ben Franklin's World. I know a lot of you have heard of and have listened to her show. She has not only helped me learn about what to say during while I'm guiding, but she has inspired further me to dig further into the research and learn more. And she started this podcast, Ben Franklin's World, in 2014. And as of now, she has 508 episodes. You can find you can find just like almost anything related to the Revolutionary era in America. Um, and let's see, she was voted, Ben Franklin's World was voted Best History Podcast from the Academy of Podcasters. She's been elected Fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, as well as an elected Fellow at the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. And most recently, a year ago, she started this thing called History Explorers Club. And it's for real nerds like all of us, where you can dive even deeper into different niche areas of early American history and like fully allow yourself to go down these rabbit holes. So if you want to dive deeper into this thing, Liz is the place to start with all this. And so I'm going to hand it over to Liz, and Ernest, don't give her a hard time.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World. I'm really delighted to be here. I used to be a tour guide. I started with the National Park Service at the Boston National Historical Park when I was an undergrad at Penn State, so several miles down the road, but nonetheless. And then when I finished graduate school and moved to Boston full time, I worked with Boston by Foot and wrote their Stamp Act 250 tour because, in Boston we were celebrating Philly by Foot. Yes. So yeah, we've been celebrating the 250, commemorating the 250th for a long time. And Carla asked me if I was going to be in Philadelphia. And I was like, well, I'm there for a hot second in April, but I'll be back in July. And she's like, you have to come meet my friends. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Because I will forget, I brought bookmarks. So if you're a fan of the podcast, I put them over here, and please make sure that you take a couple. Yep. So this year is the 250th, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I know we've all been telling stories about the history of what happened down in Independence Hall. And one of the things I was thinking about this year was first, oh my God, it's America 250. Like, how do you do an episode to commemorate that? So we were thinking about it, and I was like, what most people don't know is Richard Henry Lee's resolution that called for the Declaration of Independence actually had three parts, and nobody knows about the other two parts. And as someone who, when they have time, studies the Articles of Confederation and how it was created and then ratified, I was like, everybody should know about this resolution. So that's where we started. But that started me on a journey of thinking more critically about the process of independence. Because when we learn about it in school, we're often taught, well, I'm just going to click present here for my friends who are online. When we talk about it in school, right, it's always July 4th, or if you really want to get in the details, July 2nd, 1776. You remember the epocha that will be remembered for all ages, or whatever John Adams said. But really, it's a process that started long before that. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today, is just to give you some ideas if you wanted to talk about other history, and to talk about the process of independence. But at the Q&A, we can talk about the podcast or whatever you want to talk about. So the idea, and I'm famous for this, by the way, I will preview my slides before I show them to you. The idea that we get about independence is this image, right? John Trumbull's painting, or as Woody Holton likes to call it, the back of the $2 bill. And we have this idea that this is what the process of independence was like. They created this Declaration of Independence, and then the United States was almost free and independent, but actually it's just this wrong process. So really, historians have argued that independence was a three-legged stool. I'd like to advocate for the fact that it was probably a four-legged stool. Because first, in order to even talk about independence, you have to shift public opinion towards it. As you know, especially after the 7 Years' War and Great Britain's big victory of beating France, its mortal enemy there, they are really excited, colonial Americans, to be Britons. People like Benjamin Franklin are trying to advocate for how British they are. And that included during the war when he helped outfit Braddock's campaign. So I think the first thing you need to do is shift public opinion. Then you can get to the Declaration of Independence. But once you've declared independence, what good is it if nobody recognizes you? So then you have to get foreign allies, which will not only recognize you, but hopefully give you the military support you need to win and secure your independence. But then you have to create a government to further secure independence and actually govern. And so that's the process we'll talk about today. So shifting public opinion, we'll talk about Thomas Paine, who I don't know, but maybe Philadelphia has adopted him because he migrated first here in 1774. I don't think, like New York, they gave him any land to settle on, or New Jersey, but this is where he came. Now, Tom Paine is a really interesting figure because he's not like a lot of the founders who had, and I mean the capital F founders, the founders who had formal education. He was born in 1737 in Thetford, England, to a Quaker father and an Anglican mother. So he grew up in a very religiously diverse household, which would, kind of like many experiences here in Pennsylvania. And he was born to a corset maker. So kind of like Ben Franklin, they started him out in school young, then pulled him out of school because they couldn't afford it. And he started apprenticing with his dad to make corsets. Thomas Paine was not a very good corset maker, and like Ben Franklin, hated every other trade. He hated corset making. So kind of like Ben Franklin, he went around, the town of Thetford and looked at different places to apprentice, but still worked on with his father. But then he started going to salons and teaching school in London, and he was always pretty broke. But that was his lifestyle, the lifestyle of an intellectual. And he married his first wife, and he doesn't really talk about his first wife at all because it seems that they were madly in love, and she died in childbirth, and then it was too painful of a subject to talk about, and the child also died. So he didn't really talk about her a lot. But his father-in-law at that point was an excise man. What do excise collectors do? They collect taxes. He was a tax man. So he got a job, he passed the test and whatever, he appealed, he got a role as a tax collector. So then he moved to this town in Lewis, England. It's in Suffolk County. I went there. He still has the Bull House, which was actually his mother-in-law's house, but you can go and tour it. And Lewis is a really interesting place because even to this day, it's weirdly democratic for being in the English Empire. And they had strong debating skills. Sorry. And of course, password every time. So I'll just go to the next slide too. So he was in Lewis and he started participating in government and going to the Headstrong Club and debating it. In fact, he won the debates so often, they thought that they would name the prize after him. He was there for like 6 or 7 years. And Danielle Allen, I haven't read it yet, but Danielle Allen has a new book out called The Radical Duke. And she posits that the Duke of Richmond was paying Paine and others to write these democratic political tracts in England. And so by the time Paine needed to migrate to North America, he had to migrate because they were going to arrest him for his radical ideas. So Paine's first pamphlet was actually nothing about common sense and getting rid of the monarchy. It was actually about paying the excisemen better and reforming the excise practice. So I'm sure you've heard stories about riding the circuit courts in the early years of the Republic. It was kind of like being a taxman, like you would ride around to different places. It was physically taxing. The weather could be brutal. And who likes a taxman? So you're taking a lot of onslaught from people who are just unhappy that you're there. So Paine had met Ben Franklin while he was in London, doing the lecture thing, doing these salon things. And so he asked Franklin for a letter of introduction. And Ben Franklin wrote him one to Robert Aiken, who ran the Pennsylvania Magazine. And Franklin talked about, what a talented writer Tom Paine was. And so Aiken hired him to edit and create content, the articles for the Pennsylvania Magazine. That's when Paine started to write very overtly anti-monarchical tracts. And that eventually led to him writing Common Sense. Now, Common Sense was supposed to be a serial publication. People like Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin told him, no, you should really write it as one pamphlet. So he writes this pamphlet that was published on January 10th, 1776. So it was also the 250th anniversary year of Common Sense. And what's great about Common Sense is, and John Adams, of course, would decry this, Paine didn't originate new thoughts. He just laid them all out in a logic manner and in language that people could read and understand, that people could go and talk about in the pubs and in the taverns and in the coffee houses and on their farms with their farmhands. So he made the idea of declaring independence, of abolishing ties to the king, talking about how, if you are like an imbecile, here in society, if we don't like you, we don't vote for you. Like, if you're too dumb to participate in government, we don't do that. But if you are born an imbecile and you're the Prince of Wales, we still have to make you our king. So this is the style of writing that Thomas Paine did. He didn't write those exact lines, but that sentiment carries through. So Paine is in Philadelphia. He arrives in 74. He gets caught up in the debates and the intellectual movement, and his huge contribution to that is writing Common Sense. So we talked about Paine language. He wrote in plain language. It wasn't something that was really for insider knowledge, but he even wrote it as an anonymous pamphlet at first, which led many people to believe that John Adams wrote it. And John Adams was like, I didn't write about the brute of Great Britain, who was King George III. But he was very upset at the attention that Thomas Paine was getting for it eventually when he came out as the author. The amazing thing about Common Sense is, based on the numbers that historians have studied, they think that as much as 20% of the North American population at least talked about it, if not read the pamphlet. To put this in perspective, and Nora Sloninsky and I had a debate. What you didn't get was the cut versions of where we spent this time on the internet in our conversation researching. We picked Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code because that was a big thing that we could remember and think we could get publication numbers for. It looks like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which was this monumental monster bestseller at the time, reached 5% of the then US population. Thomas Paine, 20%. So just put that in perspective. It's a mega bestseller. So the result is by March 1776, public opinion is moving towards independence. And I'll give you further information about this as we talk about Virginia. So first, this three-legged stool of independence, I think it's a four-legged stool, shifting public opinion. But now let's talk about how we get the Declaration of Independence, the Model Treaty, and Articles of Confederation. So I just told you that we're going to do that, sorry. So the Declaration of Independence is actually a diplomatic document. It is not a legal document, even though sometimes Supreme Court decisions and other government officials cite it as one. It's technically just a diplomatic document. It was created for a couple of reasons, mostly because they needed support for the war. The United States at this time does not really have an army. I mean, it has an army, but it's pretty small in comparison. It has no navy. How are they going to beat one of the most successful armies in the world at that point? They need support. They need materiel. one of the things that we underestimate is the fact that you didn't just get musket balls. You can make them. They did that when they took down the statue in Bowling Green, right? They melted them into musket balls, but you couldn't produce cannon or muskets at scale here in the new United States at that point. You had to import it from Europe. And one of the first things that Great Britain did in the early 1770s is they turned off that switch. You were no longer allowed to import cannons, armament, mortars, that sort of thing to the colonies because the revolution was heating up. And they suspected that the colonies would be stockpiling this and ordering more to fight Great Britain. That was not something that Britain wanted them to do, so they cut off their supply. Fortunately, the early Americans were expert smugglers. And so what they did is they went to, especially to this Dutch island called St. Eustatius. It's called Statia. I've been there. The scuba diving is amazing. And I'm going back in November for the 250th anniversary of the first salute. But the Dutch and the merchants would funnel a lot of supplies through St. Eustatius. St. Eustatius was called the Golden Rock because it was so wealthy and so many supplies came through there. It was also a transshipment center for the slave trade. So they did funnel a lot of slaves. So I don't want to paint like this beautiful picture of Statia. It is a beautiful island, but has also that dark history there. But they were getting a lot of war material and supplies from them. And this became important, especially as the French, and then because they're allies of the French in that Bourbon monarchy. So yeah. Sorry, technical issues. I'm a real podcaster now. All right, hopefully that'll stop turning off. So anyway, they need to create, they have as France decides it's going to join the war and help support it, even as they're making plans to, they start getting Spain involved. Spain will not ally with the Americans. They only ally with France, but they will send a lot of aid out of duty to France, and because they don't like Great Britain either, to the American colonies to aid with their revolution. We don't know how many in supplies that either France or Spain sent because they all traded through these companies that were designed to smuggle, and no one wants to figure out how you're smuggling. It was designed to hide everything from Great Britain. Great Britain had its own spy networks. They were only able to hide part of it. But because of the fact that they were hiding this, we don't have records to give us an accurate picture. But it was a lot of support. They sent muskets, they'd send cannon, they'd send mortar, they'd send uniforms, things that the Continental Army needed. So in part, the Declaration of Independence, like France is unwilling to commit to a war until the colonies commit to departing the British Empire. So the Declaration of Independence is really a diplomatic document, not only to bolster support for the revolution here at home, but to convince France that yes, we're serious about independence and leaving the British Empire. Please come help us wage our war by enacting revenge on Great Britain. So we get that's the Declaration of Independence, but I want to tell you a little bit more about how we get there. So why independence, particularly in July 1776? We often hear this story as a top-down story. The founders in Independence Hall had this dream, John Adams especially, that these united colonies will be free and independent states. And then once you had their support, they crafted the Declaration of Independence and everyone fell in line and it was just glorious unity. But really what happened is we moved to independence because the people on the ground, people like us, everyday people, pushed the idea. Now, Virginia is really important to this story. Virginia is not only physically the largest colony in North America at this time, it's also the wealthiest. Although South Carolina, I think, also argues for wealthiest. But for this point of this talk, we're going to go with Virginia. So Virginia is really wealthy. They were not impacted by the coercive acts, those acts that punished Boston for the Boston Tea Party, closed the port of Boston, gave them a military governor, sent people, charged with capital crimes to a military court proceedings, and then the Quebec Act that wasn't part of it. Neither was the Quartering Act, but we all count them. So they weren't really impacted by those acts, but they always worried, like Pennsylvania, that they could be next. So the revolution was a little bit slower to take hold in Virginia, but people are responsive to it. They become especially responsive to it in November 1775 when Dunmore issues his Emancipation Proclamation to the enslaved people who were enslaved by patriots, revolutionaries in Virginia. He told them if they would go, any able-bodied enslaved person, men, of course, that's what they meant, any able-bodied man who's enslaved by a Virginia revolutionary, if they went to British lines and fought for the king, they would gain their freedom. Now, we know, of course, that all sorts of enslaved people, regardless of who they were enslaved by, regardless of whether they were man, woman, or child, went to British lines after Dunmore's proclamation. The Virginia economy is built basically entirely on slavery. And so the idea that Dunmore would confiscate their property really started to push for the independence movement. And then more everyday Virginians start to really get behind it because he's taking away their wealth and their property by doing this. In April of 1776, Virginia holds an election for their 5th convention. In Massachusetts, we have provincial congresses. They have one in New York. I think that's what you call it here in Pennsylvania as well. Virginia has a provincial congress, but they call it a convention, and they had a number of them. The 5th convention is about to be elected. People are so upset over Dunmore's proclamation and what is happening with this war and with Great Britain that the people from the bottom vote out all the anti-independence people in the convention. So they send in a pro-independence slate, and then in early May 15th, which is actually the same day that just down the street, really, where John Adams finally gets his resolution passed by the Second Continental Congress to have all the states basically create their own governments to govern themselves. Ironically, on the same day in Virginia, they vote to instruct their delegates to vote for independence and to push a motion through Congress to declare independence. So Virginians really come through, and this is where we get the Virginia Resolution, or Richard Henry Lee's resolution, to do it. Now, Virginia had something like 7 delegates in the Second Continental Congress, but it's up to Richard Henry Lee, who's well-liked by other congressmen, who's an older statesman when he's there. He's got a lot of political capital, and so they leave it to Lee to introduce the famous resolution on June 7th, 1776. And it has to be Virginia. I have to point this out because Massachusetts and Virginia have a rivalry. And like Ben Franklin, I was also born in Boston, so I will stand up for Massachusetts. Massachusetts and Samuel Adams, they couldn't actually introduce this resolution because people were suspicious of Massachusetts. Massachusetts had already been really radical, and in fact, Virginia called for a Continental Congress, the first one, and they called for committees of correspondence to try and keep Massachusetts in check. So it can't come from the radical New England, this resolution. It has to come from a more reasonable colony, which is why it's Virginia. Now, Lee's resolution has 3 parts. So I give you a Dunlap version of the Declaration. It says, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Part 1. Then Lee goes on to say to the model treaty. Actually, we don't have a document of the model treaty. It was really a template and a plan. So this is the signing page of the Treaty of Paris, 1783. But the second part of this goes that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances. And then we get to part 3, and this is a picture of the Articles of Confederation, which is our only founding document that is in a scroll form. 3, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So let's talk about these 3. Actually, I'm pretty much going to skip the Declaration of Independence and just focus on the Model Treaty and the Articles of Confederation. One thing you might want to think about doing on your tours is there's a lot of backroom dealing. So as you pass even like a modern day bar or tavern or a Starbucks, like the equivalent of an 18th century coffee house, right? You might want to talk about how these congressmen are out in Philadelphia and they're talking. So when Lee puts forth his June 7th resolution, Congress actually says, we don't have delegations that all have permission to vote for independence and weigh in on this question. So let's delay things for 3 weeks, which let's be honest, is not enough time to get from Georgia and back, and probably barely enough time to get to New Hampshire and back. But let's delay the vote for 3 weeks on this resolution, and we'll table it so people have time to go back and get directions to vote for independence. And this is important because Maryland and Pennsylvania specifically don't have permission to vote for independence, and New York hasn't had updated instructions for their delegates since 1775. And now it's June 76. So their instructions are really outdated. So as this is going on, people like the Adamses of Massachusetts, the Franklins of Philadelphia, they're going out and they're lobbying people to vote for Lee's resolution, to vote for independence. And so they'd go to these places that they're haunting, you know, the coffee houses, the boarding houses, the places on the ground, and they talk to their colleagues and they negotiate. It's kind of like modern day politics or politics of the past. But they try to broker a deal, right? They try to be effective congressmen. So there is this. So we have you need to talk about you should talk about how they're wheeling and dealing on the side. After they vote to declare, wait 3 weeks, they do 5 days later start acting on Lee's resolution. And I just need to get a drink of water. So what they do is on June 11th, they appoint the Committee of Five, the one that writes the Declaration of Independence. It has John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the chair. He was the first one voted in, which meant he was going to be the chair. Roger Sherman and Robert R. Livingston. Now, we've all heard of the famous three. The other two, we have a new episode coming out in a couple, like next week, about those other guys on the committee and what they did or didn't do, what we know about them. So they appoint the Committee of Five, but then the next day they appoint a second Committee of Five. It was John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, Robert Morris, and Roger Sherman, I think. No, he was on the other committee. It was Harrison of Virginia. I think it was Benjamin Harrison of Virginia to this committee to create the model treaty or the template that will be used to create foreign alliances. And then they vote a committee of 13 to prepare that Articles of Confederation. John Dickinson gets voted in first, the penman of the Revolution, as Jane Calvert likes to call him. He's going to be the principal author and drafter of the Declaration of the Articles of Confederation. And then they proceed to elect one delegate from every colony. And Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, who are also on the Declaration Committee, the Committee of Five, are also on that committee. So you can see that there's overlap on all these committees as well. As they're working on their documents and stuff, in addition to going into the taverns and boarding houses and all the places they frequent here in Philadelphia, people like John Adams are writing by mail. They're advocating for South Carolina. Don't come back here. Just stay and really try to ramp up support for independence because South Carolina is thinking about not voting for it. So he has to generate independence, movement there. Adams writes to his fellows in Massachusetts like, hey, you really got to shore up support for independence. And then Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, he recruits John Jay and is like, you have to get down here from New York and vote on this thing because if you don't, they're going to vote for independence. So you can see these sidelines starting to form. So they're not just lobbying in person, they're also lobbying by the mail. Now here in Pennsylvania, the revolutionary side threatens the Pennsylvania government with basically being ousted if they don't allow the vote for independence. So there are state politics going on there. And nobody wants to be voted out. This was really orchestrated by Benjamin Franklin, who I believe was the president of their Congress at the time. And the Pennsylvania government, it does capitulate and say, yes, we will allow you to vote for independence. Maryland also flips from the ground up. Its committees in the region, its different regions and counties, they also vote to send a pro-independence delegation to Congress. I don't remember where their capital is. Frankly, I'm not sure if it's Annapolis or Baltimore or where it is, but wherever the capital of Maryland is, that's where they decide to send their new delegates, much like Virginia did. So you see, again, this independence movement happening from the ground up. So lobbying is not just confined here to Philadelphia. It's happening all over what was then the country as well. Now, we did talk about those three committees. Jefferson, of course, is going to chair the one for independence, John Dickinson for the Articles of Confederation, and John Adams for the committee that drafts the model treaty. The first vote happens, so the second stool gets into place, the Declaration of Independence. On July 1st, they have the debate in the Second Continental Congress. In Adams's papers and in his autobiography and journal, he writes that he looked around the room and nobody stood up to argue in favor of independence. So it was natural that he would stand up and offer like this eloquent debate that no one would follow up because they just thought it was so eloquent. I love John Adams. He's very blunt. I understand John Adams, but he was full of himself. So he was there. John Dickinson, of course, stands up and he gives an impassioned speech saying, I'm not anti-independence. I'm anti-independence right now. We need to really exhaust every opportunity to reconcile with Great Britain before we go off into independence. Like, we don't know if France is going to join our side. Like, we should line up some foreign alliances before we do this. He wasn't anti-independence. He just thought the timing was all wrong. So he stood up, gave an impassioned speech, but even he could tell by the end of the day that he was pretty sure he'd lost that vote. And then on July 2nd, they vote for independence. And so the Declaration of Independence carries, and that's how that happened. The other two legs of the stool, model treaty and the Articles of Confederation, thank you, they're going to take years to get into order. They actually, the Committee of Five that works on the model treaty, John Adams, they will, he in that committee innovate on foreign relations. Foreign relations by this point in the 18th century are mostly based on military alliances. Who's going to ally with the small continental army and the barely existing continental navy? There's no leverage there. And John Adams and others are like, we're leaving the British Empire. We do not want to be entangled in the stuff going on in Europe. We just want to be left alone and do our own thing. So he comes up with this idea that treaties, foreign alliances, rather than be based on military alliances, could be based on commercial alliances. So the idea that you would set up favorable trading status with different nations and secure trade routes and make, trade relationships was a way to create alliances. Now, on the ground, on paper, this all looked fine and dandy, but let's think about how Benjamin Franklin pulled this off in France. He was on the committee, so he knew what the model treaty was looking like. In 1778, when they finally get word of the victory at Saratoga, he goes to the Comte of Vergennes and he says, now is the time to do it. And Vergennes is like, yes, we finally have our navy rebuilt from the 7 Years' War. We're about ready to enter this war, so let's talk. So they finally start negotiating, and rather than one treaty, they get two. So the first one, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which was signed in February of 78, that is based on Adams's plan of commercial alliances. But that wasn't good enough from France. And again, the United States doesn't really have leverage here. So France comes in and said, we will join the war, but we don't want you to exit it early. We don't want you to negotiate with Great Britain for peace if we're not involved. You have to agree that we'll be in the room when that happens. And they agree to these terms, and then you get the other treaty that comes around, which is a military alliance and a political alliance that happens. So John Adams, I think he had a good plan. I think it was completely idealistic, but the idea that we would form trade agreements and that's how we create allies is an idea that carries forth even into our own present day. So the model treaty really did become a model, a template that the new American government would use. Now, in the Articles of Confederation side, John Dickinson, you can go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in his papers, you'll find Dickinson's draft. He writes a beautiful constitution. It has some things that might surprise you. We think of the Articles of Confederation as this government where the states have all the power, or most of the power, and that the central government fails because the states are fighting each other all the time. That is not the government that Dickinson wrote. He actually wrote something that looks more like the Constitution we have now than the Articles of Confederation that the states would ratify. He wrote for a strong central government. He included women in his Constitution. It was the first time that women, his or her, women were written. He wrote the religious freedom section, the freedom of worship, to include his or her based on his or her beliefs. In the marginalia, he also started to write about whether the United States should consider abolishing slavery as it was counter to their founding principles. And so Dickinson, he didn't just write those, he actually freed his enslaved people. He did it on a scaled thing because of the economics of the war. He basically gave them all their emancipation documents in 77, 78, but said they're only going into effect once the economy improves and you can actually support yourselves. That is the interpretation I got when I went to see his homestead in Delaware. But it really was an impressive constitution. But then Thomas Burke of North Carolina comes in and he said, no, we just fought to get rid of, we're fighting to get rid of a central monarch. We should have a weaker government, central government, and allow the states, allow the real power to lie in the states and closer to the people. And his Article 2 carries, and that's why we got the Articles of Confederation that we did get, that were a bit of a disaster. So those are really the ways that independence happened. You can have your Declaration of Independence, but it's not going to mean much unless you can actually carry it forward into independence and then sustain that independence, which is why Richard Henry Lee in Virginia wrote it into Lee's resolution that you needed these three things: a declaration, a model treaty, or, in foreign alliances, or a system of government to help govern the new nation later. So just some things to think about as you're giving your tours. And also, again, that idea that it's everyday people who made this possible. It wasn't the capital F founders pushing their ideas down on everybody. Yes, they had ideas. Yes, people were receptive or not receptive to them, but it's really the people from the ground up who make this movement happen. And I've tried to make that case to you today. So if you would like to go deeper on this, of course, we have episodes on the podcast for you. Episode 431 covers common sense. At 250, we talked to Norris Lenimsky at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. We also have another episode, a few episodes after that, where we did a live podcast inside the Bull House on the 250th anniversary of Common Sense. We just finished a series where we talked from episode 443 through 445, where we looked at the three layers of the Lee resolution. And then episode 325 is Woody Holton's book, Liberty is Sweet. It's a big narrative sweep. And I've read a lot of books on the revolution, and his is the first one that I really feel covers both the military and the politics really well. It's a really long book, as you might expect. But if you're looking for a narrative that is steeped in research that's going to give you both the political side and the military side, there's Woody. And of course, you can listen to the podcast there. And now, your questions.
Yes. Got one from Zoom. It's from Rick. Is there any
Hi, Rick.
documentation that any members of the Second Congress specifically said that the Declaration was intended for the French?
I can't think of anybody who said that specifically, but it was knowledge, right? They knew they were in this war, they knew that they were losing it, and they needed support. And so the scholars that I have spoken to and read have made the case that yes, it's designed, of course, to rally support at home, but it is also designed to show the French that they are serious about leaving the British Empire. Yes.
Can we do a time warp?
Sure. What's your question?
What if Thomas Paine had never been born? How would this have looked different?
As I said, the ideas that Paine put forth weren't new. So the question was, if Thomas Paine, it's a time warp question, right? Our alternate history question, or hypothetical. If Thomas Paine hadn't been born, how might the revolution have been different? Someone else, I think, would have done it. The ideas were not original to Paine. He just made it plain. Okay.
I'm sure things would have happened. But
right.
What about the timing of them, though? How far back do you think we would have been without that?
The thing that's inseparable for me is Virginians were really upset about Dunmore's proclamation. And so I think you would have seen Virginians move within the same time period for independence. Would other states have followed where I don't know, because as you can see in Pennsylvania, Maryland, even in South Carolina, they still need the people to vote to change people's minds about it. and that had to come from the ground up. So John Dickinson may have gotten what he wanted and things happened a little later. That would have also thrown a monkey wrench in the whole France joining because of victory at Saratoga. We'll assume that the Battle of Saratoga still happens and the Americans still win. Because at that point, even before they get to independence, France is sending aid, and a lot of the military supplies they sent arrive in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts ports just ahead of the Battle of Saratoga. So that is in part why the Americans win it, is because they had those fresh supplies.
Oh, you just answered the question I was going to ask you. I did not know until last year that most of the ammunition on the field at Saratoga was French, and I didn't understand where it came from, but you just explained it.
Yeah, so the Congress, there's not just the official journals of the Congress, there are the secret journals. They're actually a document. It's the secret journals of the Continental Congress. But they also had a secret committee. They had a couple secret committees, but the one secret committee that involved Silas Deane, Benjamin Franklin, I don't know if John Adams was on it, but probably, and a couple other congressmen, they were orchestrating early on. They send Deane in 75 to France to try and negotiate for supplies. And the Comte de Vergennes is very amenable to this, because keep in mind, Great Britain really kicked France's butt during the 7 Years' War. They want revenge. They had felt humiliated. Their army and navy was decimated, and that is why the French don't join in right away. Is they don't have the capacity to really jump in, and even if they did, they want to make sure they're in a position to really win. So they're rebuilding their army and navy as they're having these negotiations. So what Vergennes gives permission to is like, we're going to funnel money through this guy Beaumarchais, and he creates this company. I think it's Richard Hortela's and Company, but they start getting other merchants to supply. So they're selling to Richard Hortela's and Company and not the French government giving Americans direct aid. So it's all covert, but that is happening. And those are the supplies there that end up in Saratoga. They try to go over a couple times, but they're always stopped. But then they're able to freely go. Meanwhile, the British know that this is happening. They keep raising this in the French court, but the French have plausible deniability. And so they make use of that to deny that's what they're really doing. Spain as well. Mhm.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Moreno. I'm with We Venture and MOAR, the Museum of the American Revolution here in Philly.
I'm going
Uh,
tomorrow.
Oh, nice. Okay. Definitely see the first floor. We have a special exhibit on the Declaration of Independence 250th anniversary, and it explores the connections between, what happened here in Philadelphia and how it inspired different movements. You know that already because you do a podcast and stuff, but I want to let you know that at MOAR, when we're getting trained, um, we're asked, and this is like part of homework. When we're getting trained, we are asked to listen to your podcasts. Some of the episodes, that's how relevant your content is,
Well,
because
thank you.
that is for professionals at the museum. So your work is impressive. Your research is so deep, and it's inspired not only people at the museum, but also at We Venture. I've spoken or I've heard of 4 different guides at We Venture who have loved your podcast. That's my preamble. Um, so I have a lot of admiration for you and your work and your research, and yeah, it's a great honor to be in the same space as you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So now I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Just to keep it short. You refer to the French and Indian War as the 7-Year War. I understand that that is a distinction in Europe versus America. But my question is, why do you choose the European side
Okay.
as opposed to the American version of it? That is one. The other one has to do with um, it's not a question, but it's more of a fact. You mentioned things for us guides, and this is really cool because you mentioned January 10th and July 9th. But for everybody, um, it happened in Philadelphia first. So the January 10th that you mentioned happened on January 9th in Philadelphia. The publication of Common Sense, with which really shaped the perspective and what you were saying about public opinion. And that was January 9th here in Philly, but it was January 10th everywhere else, which is great. Another fun fact about Philadelphia is July 8th being the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence here at Independence Hall, where Commodore Barry is. That is where it inspired a lot of people. But then you mentioned a really interesting fact, which we also have at Moore, with the uh, statue of King George III in New York on July 9th. That happened the next day. So, to all the folks in New York and in Boston and everywhere else, Philadelphia was first. All right.
It's true.
Yes.
They didn't even read it in Boston until the 10th. So
Okay.
it reads as well as news. To answer your question about the terminology, we keep in mind that wars are typically named by the victors. So of course the British called it the French and Indian War, and that the Americans' perspective is valid because the war here didn't take place over 7 years; it took place over 9 years because George Washington went out and started it. Yeah. So in 1754, but the war in England in Europe starts a few years later. After talking to a lot of scholars, there are scholars who make an argument that we really should refer to it as a 7 Years' War because the French and Indian War vilifies really important Native allies, and that it wasn't a war that was being inflicted, like Indigenous peoples didn't start that war. They were involved in it because France and Great Britain asked them to get involved. And so they were doing that to secure and keep fresh, really important allies to them. And as we really try to tell the complete story and we look for different guests, I want to just be considerate of that because we do try to talk to Native and guests. In fact, later, probably in early September, I just recorded it. Jeremy Johnson of the Delaware Tribe of Indians, which is now based in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, that's part of the Lenape people as well. He did an episode. So I try, and I will adjust when Indigenous people, because sometimes they like to be called Native Americans and others, they will use the term Indian. So it's kind of a fluid thing based on people's identity. But that's why I do it. It's out of consideration for our Indigenous neighbors. Mhm.
Speaking of dates, today is the July 15th, Magna Carta. So, beginning of it all.
I had another document.
What part did this sending of Dean over and then Franklin's dealings with upstairs in the Carpenter's Hall in December of 75? How did that all dovetail together? Did those fellows come here as a result of Dean going to France or what?
Which Franklin thing are you talking about in Carpenter's Hall? Oh, yeah. France, Vergennes send, and even before Vergennes, there was, I'm going to butcher this, Choiseul. He was the minister before Vergennes. They were sending spies to every major North American city to find out what was happening and to find out if the revolution had legs. And so the French were really well informed, even though they weren't here on the ground. So I think it's all part of the same thing because Franklin is on the committee that sends Dean instructions about what he should do. The curious thing, and you may have heard this in an episode, Emily Sneff, who helped create a bunch of the exhibits about the Declaration of Independence around the city, she has a new book out called When the Declaration of Independence Was News. But we talked about the fact that it was translated into different languages, but the Continental Congress only published it in English, and then they only sent one copy to France, and it was lost at sea. It was captured. So they didn't have like a good mechanism for actually getting word about this stuff to France. And Emily also talks about how, like in a German translation, the one they make here in Pennsylvania takes in the nuance and really work to translate the meaning of the English words into German so people would understand the context of everything that was going on. But when you look at German translations that are happening in Europe, Dutch translations, French translations, they're not trying to get at the meaning and the context of what's going on. It is like a straight English word to foreign language word translation. So even the document that the French get was not really thoughtfully prepared in the way that you would think the Second Continental Congress, who wants French support, might have done it. So that's like a surprising detail of revolution I only learned recently.
This may sound like a dumb question.
There's no dumb questions.
30,000 feet in the air.
Okay.
What is the first thing you think of when you think about Benjamin Franklin?
Aside from the fact that he was born in Boston, um,
He had,
No.
he had to flee.
no, I actually, when I think about Benjamin Franklin, and I'm not a Franklin expert, I called the podcast Ben Franklin's World because he was curious about everything, and even people who don't know his name know he's a man from the 18th century, and that's really our sweet spot. Plus, like me, he was born in Boston. I also had a sojourn in Pennsylvania. I went to college at Penn State. Um, you know, I think it's his ability to learn things and his savviness in the printing business. I'd really actually like to know even more about the role Deborah Franklin played into that, because she was trained as a storekeeper. Franklin really wasn't. And she kept that business going. But like, he's able to retire at the age of 42. Like, how cool is that? I'm not even 42 anymore. Like, I haven't retired. I just think that that's an amazing story. And that's what I think of when I think of Ben Franklin.
Thank you.
So I have two from the Zoom friends, one from Mark. What was the model democracy that the founding fathers looked for inspiration?
That's a great question, Mark, and a question I'm still looking at. The United States wasn't the first republic, and it wasn't the first democracy. You had the Dutch Republic, and to a limited extent, the Swiss Confederation as well also had democratic elements. So these are things I'm still researching. They also looked a lot to Rome and the Senate period. So these were men, and we can all call them men. They were men who really knew their history, and they knew of these examples, and they studied them. Sarah Giorgini, who was recently on the podcast to talk about the model treaty, really emphasized that these guys were real well read, but when the information they needed came up, they were studying on the fly. So they were reading these constitutions and other histories of these types of government. So I don't know to what extent X number comes from Rome and X number comes from the Dutch and X number comes from the Swiss. But it's definitely there. And they are also really looking at British constitutionalism because that's what they know. And again, they view this parting as not we're tired of your constitutional system. It's, makes us the free and best people in the world. We're just tired of all the taxation and the no representation.
All right. And one more from Charlie. Did Jefferson incorporate any of Paine's common sense dialogue into the Declaration? Did Jefferson respect Paine as an ally?
I don't know if they had a personal relationship. The 1,337 words of the Declaration of Independence don't contain a Paine phrase, but Paine is the first one to really go after the British king to make the idea of separation from the monarchy, which was an emotional and cultural issue as well as a political one for Americans. It was a touchy subject. He made it seem very obvious, common sense, if you will, that they would separate. And you can see in the 26 or 27 grievances that are in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson takes that same approach. They don't blame Parliament. They don't blame the ministers. Everything in those grievances is the fault of the king.
And just one little thank you for focusing on Thomas Paine, since I went to Thomas Paine Elementary School and I went to a college founded by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So thank you for the shout out for the guys.
Oh, God. All right, any other questions?
I do.
Oh, more.
Sorry. So Lafayette was like a huge popular Revolutionary War hero. And of course, he was very French. Did he have any role to play in the French-American alliance in establishing that?
Yeah, so the other thing we need to say about Lafayette, he's also very young. I think he's like 17 when he comes over. He's very young. He's injured at Brandywine in September of 78. He is sent back to France to help bolster the relationship that's there to get. This was something else I just found out this year, but it makes sense now that I put all the puzzle pieces together. The French don't send the French army right away. The French army doesn't come over until 1780-81. So the support that they render from 78 to 1780, late 1780, is just naval support. And the French thought that that would be enough to turn the tide for the Americans. But year after year that they're spending lots of money to support this war, they realize they're not making headway. And that's when they send Rochambeau with an army. And part of that is because Lafayette is there telling them, you can't win this war if we don't send the army in. And so he is integral into that in that respect. And don't forget your bookmarks. They're on the free table. The rubber.
Hello, this is Jonathan again. Just saying thank you for your time. But nowadays, choosing sides, you have to. You can't be neutral in sides, like in moments of despair and oppression, like what we're living nowadays. So, waging war on citizens of the world, destroying civilian lives, and transporting foreign peoples to complete works of death, desolation, and tyranny. These are words that Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, but they resonate nowadays to our immigrant communities, especially. There is tyranny in the government, there is death, literal death, desolation. What do we do about this? Because they could change the world back in 1776 when they declared independence, and when it became obvious in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. We're not rich, we're not at that level, but what do we do when our communities are being attacked by a tyrannical government?
It's a really good question, and it's a tough question. I think it's normally I would tell you go vote, right? Because that moves the needle. Unfortunately, as we know, there are these acts in place, and I don't know the politics of Pennsylvania at the moment. But I can tell you, having lived in Virginia, we had to take a photo ID to go vote. And that's one of the laws that the Save America Act is trying to enact nationally. So voting, getting out in the street and protesting, those again are complicated issues because we've seen with ICE. But it's really important to get voices heard. I think one of the things that maybe we should look at, and this is just off the top of my head, is if we think about how Americans are spreading these ideas, how common sense was spread, it's by print and then word of mouth. So I wonder if we look at some of the early ideas of the revolution, and how the print networks and the neighborhood networks got the information out, if maybe that is a way to raise voice and awareness, and help people do things like get to the polls or protest and have their voices heard. We still live in a democracy, so we have to change the people in office. to be able to do things effectively. But I think we can see in the civil rights movement, it involves a lot of nonviolent and sometimes violent protest as well. I'm not advocating for violence, just saying that it has happened, and that is a model that exists in history to look at. In terms of like being a tour guide and talking about it, my approach has always been the approach I learned in the National Park Service. I was in the National Park Service in the early 2000s, so I didn't have to deal with the problems that they're experiencing today in their line of work. But we were not supposed to talk about modern day religion or politics, and we were supposed to present ideas and not tell people what to make of those. And that's something I try to do in the podcast. So yes, I have a perspective. I do believe that we cannot fully understand early America unless we tell the complete story. And the complete story is it's a very diverse place with very diverse ideas and people all trying to live together, sometimes in peace, often in conflict, and we need to be able to talk about it. I also think that we can't really move on from the past if we don't learn from it. And I think if you know your history, like you guys do, I'm sure you could point out moments in our past and in our present, which, doesn't that look familiar? Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think you can point to both things happening. So I think one of the ideas is to educate people, but don't come down hard like you should think this. But certainly where you can, raise awareness that this is happening and how that impacts you or people in your community, and let people know. And I think that's part of that network, right, of word of mouth support and even in the print culture. So it's not easy. I wish it was, but that's what I would say.
All right. Thanks, Liz, very much for coming and joining us. And thanks, Carla, for hooking everything up. So we appreciate that. Right now, I think Mike has a few words for us.
Hi, everybody. How you doing? You may have seen an announcement about Saturday night at Carpenter's Hall. There's a launch of a beer that is in honor of Timothy Matlack, who is, if you read Forbes magazine back in 2019, then you know he is America's first paleontologist. If you haven't read that, Google it. Timothy Matlack, America's first paleontologist. It has to do with Woodbury Creek, New Jersey, Caspar Wister. It's an interesting story. But this beer is about him as the scribe of the Declaration. July 19th, as you all know really well, is the 250th of the engrossed copy of the Declaration of Independence. So there is a fee for this. The distillery that made the beer, they're the sponsor for the night. They also make rum and bourbon. You get a drink and a commemorative glass. And so if you'd like to come, if you haven't been to the second floor for a while, or if you know somebody who'd like to be there, I'll be there. I'll host the tour. So please give it a thought. I have a couple of beers left if Carla hasn't drank them all. So please take one home or drink one while you're here. I think I have 2 or 3 left. Thank you all. And it's at 5 o'clock, not 4. It's at 5. They want the beer? No. Saturday night, the 18th. Okay. Or the eve of the 19th. All and Michael Norris and Alyssa, as you know, from Carpenter's Hall. It's due to their generosity. But it's at 5 o'clock. There was a mistake in the previous one. 4. Yeah, it's 5.
All right. To piggyback on that, the American Vegan Center asked to share. They're doing a free workshop presentation, Greener Philly Tourism. How do we get there? On August 6th at 6:30 over the American Vegan Center. Should be a lot of useful info for tour guides and useful ideas coming from Shane. Snacks will be served. Register in advance. Please link in the newsletter from our corporate members.
Great.
So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Is Rachel Kraft here? Oh, Rachel. All right. So, Rachel, congratulations on getting certified. So, and Todd's gonna take a picture of you. So to make it, doubly, triply official. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Good job. And is Nick Direcka here? Okay, I have his thing. These are all for those of you who may not have received them and want them. This is the last of our stash for the Declaration of Independence. It will be just over there, which you can take. Just to mention the upcoming events, we have on July 18th, History Matters. We have on the 21st, the coffee break, which Jim oversees. It's a lot of fun at the Visitor Center. You learn great stuff. July 21 is the book club, Grave Dealings, and that's Pam who oversees that. On July 28th, Independence Seaport Museum, you can sign up online, and that will be the exhibit about China. And anything else? Who else told me about that? Okay. And I think that is it so far. Any questions? Yeah, Ed. Okay.
And the next meeting in August will be featuring Brian Carpenter. He's the curator of Indigenous Materials and director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at the American Philosophical Society. Next year, the exhibition at APS will be on this subject. He is working on curating this at this time. Just to give you a preview of what we had talked about, he's going to give coverage of the different federally recognized Lenape tribes in Oklahoma and Wisconsin and the First Nations in Ontario, and of views that they variously hold in relation to various Lenape identified groups in the tri-state region, and those groups' explanation of their own history. So I've asked Brian to focus in on helping us better understand the Lenape history here in the Delaware Valley of the past, and he's certainly going to focus on that, but as well bring it into the future so that we better understand what we say when we honor the Lenape presence here in the tri-state area, the land of Lenape. So I think this will lend us all some clarity to our presentations when we do our tour groups. I'm very excited to welcome him. I hope we have great support, and I hope you all be here. Thank you.
Vincent, it's opening the China trade.
Thank you. Yeah, the exhibit is opening the China trade, the one at the Seaport Museum. Thanks, Vince. I think that's it. Does anyone have anything else? Yes.
If there's any new members haven't signed up for the profit sharing for the selling the t-shirts, you could pick up one of these, contact me. I'll get you set up with the cards that you can give out to your customers for discounts on any of the t-shirts that are on the website.
Thank you.
All right, and you probably all know that the President's House has a new exhibit up. So when you have a chance, take a look. Yes, yes. All right. That's it for today's meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending.